10 years, 3 jobs, 60-hour weeks, ramen dinners, and canceled vacations. Also, I could hold the keys to 2847 Maple Street, a 4-bedroom colonial that represented everything I'd sacrificed for, everything I'd dreamed about since sleeping in my childhood bedroom until I was 28. The housewarming party was supposed to be my victory lap. The moment when my family would finally see that the daughter they'd always considered the struggling one had built something worth celebrating. I'd sent the invitations 3 weeks early, called to confirm, texted reminders. Even my mother had said, "We'll be there, sweetie," in that tone that usually meant she was proud of me for once. The clock struck 6:15 p.m. Every chair at my dining room table sat empty. The prime rib I'd spent 2 days' pay on was getting cold. Candles flickered over untouched wine glasses while I stood in my dream kitchen, whispering to walls that finally belonged to me. They're just running late. Families are always late. But deep down, in the part of my heart that had been holding its breath for 36 years, I already knew the truth. They weren't coming. They never were. The question was what I'd do with that truth once I finally stopped pretending it wasn't real. My name is Aurora Anderson. I'm 36 years old, and for 10 years, I lived in studio apartments that smelled like other people's cooking, worked double shifts that left my feet screaming and my back aching, and saved every dime while my family mocked me for dreaming too big. The journey to 2847 Maple Street began in a 1-bedroom apartment on the wrong side of Hartford, where the radiator clanged like a broken heart, and the walls were so thin I could hear my neighbor's television until 2 a.m. But every night, after my shifts at the hospital cafeteria and weekend cleaning gig at the mall, I'd sit at my thrift store kitchen table, with real estate listings spread across its surface like treasure maps. Those listings became my obsession, my escape, my prayer book. I'd circle properties in red ink, calculate mortgage payments on napkins, and dream about backyards where I could plant tomatoes and hang laundry on lines that belonged to me. The pictures showed lives I wanted to live: kitchens with islands, bedrooms with walk-in closets, bathrooms with soaking tubs where I could wash away the smell of industrial floor cleaner and cafeteria grease. Above my bed, I'd taped a photograph torn from a magazine, a 2-story colonial with white shutters and a wraparound porch, the word home scribbled across it in my own handwriting. Every morning, that image was the first thing I saw when I opened my eyes. Every night, it was the last thing I looked at before exhaustion pulled me into dreams about mortgage approvals and property inspections. The work was brutal and relentless. Night shifts scrubbing office floors in downtown Hartford, my hands cracking from chemicals that stripped away more than just dirt and grime. My knees bled through the holes in my work pants as I crawled under desks where executives had made decisions about budgets larger than my annual salary. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was literally cleaning up after people who could afford what I was desperately saving for. During the day, I served food to hospital staff who made more in a month than I'd see in 6. Slinging trays of institutional meatloaf and mashed potatoes while doctors discussed vacation homes in the Hamptons and nurses planned kitchen renovations. I smiled and nodded and tried not to think about how my dinner would be another bowl of ramen, eaten alone while calculating whether I could afford both groceries and heat in the same month. But the hardest part wasn't the work or the exhaustion, or even the loneliness of coming home to apartments that never felt like home. The hardest part was my family's reaction to my dream. The memory that still burns like acid in my throat happened 3 years into my savings journey, during Thanksgiving dinner at my parents' house in West Hartford. The same dining room where I'd grown up feeling like the odd one out, the dreamer in a family of pragmatists who measured success by how quickly you settled into acceptable mediocrity. My brother Marcus was holding court from his position at the head of the table, his success in insurance sales announced by his BMW in the driveway, and his wife's diamond tennis bracelet catching the candlelight. He'd been drinking since football started, his voice growing louder with each beer, as he regaled the table with stories about his latest sales commission. That's when the conversation turned to my situation. "Aurora still thinks she's going to buy a house," Marcus said, beer in hand, his voice carrying the kind of condescending amusement usually reserved for children who believe in Santa Claus. "You? Buy a house? You can barely keep your car running." The room erupted in laughter. Not the warm, inclusive laughter of family sharing joy, but the sharp, cutting sound of people bonding over someone else's perceived inadequacy. My sister joined in, her laugh high and bright, probably relieved that someone else was the target of family scrutiny for once. I smiled and nodded like I was in on the joke, but inside I swallowed that insult like fire, feeling it burn all the way down to settle in my stomach alongside the turkey that suddenly tasted like sawdust and shame. They weren't cruel strangers or jealous acquaintances. They were my blood, my mother, who adored my sister's job as a teacher and bragged about her pension plan to anyone who'd listen. My father, who admired Marcus's business acumen and introduced him at church as my successful son. And me, Aurora, the dreamer, the one who'd never quite measure up to their practical expectations. In their eyes, I was the family project that hadn't turned out as planned. The daughter who worked too hard for too little, who lived in apartments they were embarrassed to visit, who had ideas above her station and dreams that made them uncomfortable because achieving them would prove that their own settled lives were choices rather than inevitable outcomes. But what they never understood was that every insult became a brick in my foundation. Every dismissive comment became fuel for late nights and early mornings. Every time they suggested I should be more realistic about my prospects, I worked another shift and saved another $100 toward proving them wrong. The vision board above my bed grew over the years. Pictures of kitchen islands and hardwood floors, paint samples and furniture catalogs, floor plans sketched on graph paper during my lunch breaks. I was building my dream house twice, once in my imagination and once in my savings account, dollar by exhausting dollar. Because I'd made myself a promise during that Thanksgiving dinner, sitting in a room full of people who loved me but didn't believe in me. One day, they'd walk into a home I'd built with my own hands, my own sacrifice, my own refusal to accept their limitations as my ceiling. They'd see the woman I'd always been beneath the work uniforms and discount store clothes. They'd see who I really was. And maybe, finally, they'd understand that dreaming big wasn't a character flaw. It was a superpower they'd never been brave enough to develop. The house at 2847 Maple Street became more than a property I wanted to buy. It became proof that the daughter they'd underestimated was actually the only one in the family with enough courage to bet everything on herself. That dream was about to become reality. The question was whether they'd be brave enough to witness it. The closing attorney's office smelled like leather and legal documents, but all I could focus on was the weight of the keys in my palm. 10 years of dreaming, saving, and sacrifice had led to this moment, standing on the front porch of 2847 Maple Street, inserting my key into a lock that would finally respond to my touch. The realtor's smile blurred through my tears as she handed me the deed with my name printed in black ink. Aurora Anderson, homeowner. The porch creaked under my steps like it had been waiting for me all these years, recognizing the footsteps of someone who'd earned the right to call this place home. Walking through rooms that were finally mine felt like stepping into a life I'd only imagined during those late nights in cramped apartments. Hardwood floors that gleamed in afternoon sunlight streaming through windows I could decorate however I wanted. A kitchen with an island where I could prepare meals for people I loved. Bedrooms with enough space for furniture that wasn't secondhand and dreams that weren't borrowed. But owning the house was just the beginning. Making it home required something deeper than a mortgage payment and property deed. I painted walls until midnight, my fingers raw from gripping brushes that transformed neutral builder beige into colors that reflected who I was becoming. The living room became sage green, peaceful as the future I was creating. The kitchen walls turned warm yellow, bright as the laughter I imagined filling the space during family dinners that would erase years of feeling like I didn't quite belong anywhere. Each room carried my sweat, my fingerprints, my heartbeat embedded in every decision about paint colors and furniture placement. I hung curtains I'd sewn myself during lunch breaks at the hospital, fabric chosen from remnant bins but stitched with the kind of care that comes from someone who understands the difference between a house and a home. The dining room became my masterpiece. I'd found the table at an estate sale in West Hartford, solid oak beneath layers of scratches and neglect, abandoned by a family who'd probably taken it for granted. For weeks, I'd stripped away decades of damage, sanding until my arms ached and my lungs burned from sawdust that settled like determination in every corner of my garage. When I finally ran my palm across the smooth, restored surface, feeling the grain that had been hidden under years of carelessness, I whispered to the empty room, "This will hold our family again." The table could seat 8 people comfortably, 10 if we squeeze together the way families do during holidays when everyone comes home and the house overflows with voices and stories and the kind of chaos that feels like love. I could picture my mother at the head, carving turkey with the same precision she'd used to carve up my dreams for years. My father would sit to her right, telling stories about his construction work while my siblings filled the spaces between with laughter that no longer excluded me. For the first time in my adult life, I would be the hostess instead of the guest who never quite felt welcome. I would serve food I'd prepared in my own kitchen, offer wine from glasses that belonged to me, create memories in a space that reflected everything I'd worked to become. The invitations took 3 drafts to get right. The first version was too casual, like I was embarrassed to claim my achievement. The second was too formal, as if I was trying to prove something instead of simply celebrating it. The third felt perfect, warm but proud, excited but not desperate. "You're invited to a housewarming celebration at my new home," I wrote in careful cursive that had taken years of practice to perfect. "Dinner at 6 p.m. I can't wait to welcome you to 2847 Maple Street and share this milestone with the people who matter most." I mailed them on a Tuesday, each envelope addressed by hand, to ensure that personal touch that email couldn't provide. My parents, my sister, my brother and his wife, even my cousins who lived an hour away but had always made time for important family events. The mailbox at the end of my new driveway felt like a launching pad for the next chapter of my story. For 10 years, I'd been the family member who received invitations to other people's achievements. Now I was the one extending hospitality, offering inclusion, creating the kind of gathering that would finally position me as someone whose success was worth celebrating. Days passed without replies, but I wasn't worried. My family had never been prompt with RSVPs, preferring the casual assumption that of course they'd show up for important moments. When no one called by the weekend, I laughed it off with the kind of forced cheer that comes from someone determined not to let doubt creep into perfect plans. "They'll come," I told myself while polishing wine glasses that had never held wine. "They'll have to. It's my home." The week before the party, I started cooking lasagna that could feed 12 people, because I'd learned from years of family gatherings that Marcus always brought unexpected guests. Garlic bread from scratch, because my mother had always complained about store-bought versions at other people's houses. A chocolate cake from the recipe my grandmother had passed down, because dessert was the part of family dinners that everyone remembered long after the main course was forgotten. I bought wine that cost more than I usually spent on groceries for a week, but this was an investment in relationships that had been strained by years of financial inequality. The good wine would show that I'd arrived, that the daughter who'd once served them dinner on mismatched plates could now provide the kind of hospitality they'd expect from someone who'd finally made something of herself. The dining room table I'd restored by hand was set 3 days early, each place setting arranged with the precision of someone who'd worked in food service long enough to know that presentation mattered as much as preparation. Cloth napkins instead of paper, real flowers instead of artificial arrangements. Everything designed to announce that Aurora Anderson had not just bought a house, she'd created a home worthy of the family who doubted she ever would. Friday night, 24 hours before the party, I stood in my kitchen surrounded by covered dishes and pristine place settings, breathing in the scent of success that smelled like fresh paint, new furniture, and possibilities that had been earned rather than inherited. Tomorrow, my family would walk through my front door and see who I'd become. They'd sit at my table and taste food prepared in my kitchen and finally understand that the dreamer they'd dismissed had been the only one brave enough to make dreams real. Tomorrow, everything would change. 6 o'clock arrived with the punctuality of a death sentence. I stood in my kitchen, adjusting the temperature on the roast that had been filling my house with the scent of rosemary and butter for the past 4 hours. The smell was everything I'd imagined during those years of ramen dinners and takeout containers. Rich, welcoming, the kind of aroma that announces someone who loves you, has been working in this kitchen all day. Jazz drifted softly from the speakers I'd installed in the living room, Ella Fitzgerald's voice weaving through rooms that had been decorated with the precision of someone staging the most important performance of her life. Every surface gleamed under warm lighting that cast shadows designed to hide flaws and highlight beauty. I wore the navy dress my mother had once said looked too expensive for someone in my position, a comment that had stung for months until I decided to wear it anyway. Tonight, it felt like armor made of silk and determination, proof that her position and mine were no longer the same thing. The dining table looked like a magazine spread, bone china I'd saved for 6 months to afford, crystal wine glasses that caught the candlelight like captured stars. Cloth napkins folded with the kind of precision I'd learned during my brief stint waiting tables in college. when I'd thought customer service might be temporary instead of the foundation for everything I'd eventually build. By 6:15, I was checking the driveway through the living room curtains, looking for headlights that would announce the arrival of people whose approval I'd been chasing for 36 years. The street remained empty except for the glow of lampposts that illuminated nothing but my growing anxiety. 6:30 came and went with the silence of disappointment learning to breathe. I adjusted the roast temperature again, not because it needed adjusting, but because standing still meant confronting the possibility that was growing larger with each passing minute, the possibility that I'd prepared this evening for no one but myself. The clock's ticking grew louder than Ella's voice, each second marking the space between expectation and reality. I found myself counting heartbeats, calculating how many had passed since I'd mailed those invitations with trembling hands, and imagined the conversations they'd generate around dinner tables I'd never been invited to host. At 7, I called my mother. Her phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail, her voice bright and cheerful as it announced she was probably out having fun somewhere and would return calls when I get around to it. The casual dismissal in that recorded message felt like a slap delivered through fiber optic cables. My sister's phone went straight to voicemail. Marcus didn't answer either. One by one, the people I'd spent a decade trying to impress proved they couldn't be bothered to even offer excuses for their absence. By 7:30, hope had crystallized into humiliation so pure it took my breath away. I sat down at the head of my carefully set table, staring at 12 untouched plates that reflected my face back at me in fragments, distorted pieces of a woman who'd built her dreams around people who'd never shared them. The silver spoons I'd polished that morning showed a warped version of reality, like funhouse mirrors that revealed truths I'd been avoiding. In their curved surfaces, I looked smaller than I'd felt in years, diminished by the weight of empty chairs and uneaten food, and the kind of silence that screams louder than any argument. The roast was perfect. The wine was breathing. The candles flickered with romantic lighting that illuminated nothing but my own reflection multiplied across 12 place settings that would never be disturbed by the people I'd set them for. That's when the internal voice I'd been suppressing for hours finally found its volume. "I built this for you," I whispered to the empty chairs, my words barely audible above the jazz that now sounded like a soundtrack to solitude. I saved every dollar. I worked every double shift. I sacrificed everything, vacations, relationships, nights out with friends, so I could create a space worthy of your presence. The words came faster now, 10 years of suppressed hurt pouring out like water from a broken dam. I painted these walls thinking about your reactions. I chose this furniture imagining your comfort. I planned this menu around your preferences, remembering every comment you'd ever made about other people's cooking, other people's homes, other people's attempts to bring you joy. The candles flickered as if responding to my confession, casting shadows that danced across walls I'd painted with dreams that were apparently mine alone. I wore this dress because I wanted you to see that I'd made something of myself. I cooked this food because I wanted you to taste success that came from my own hands, my own determination, my own refusal to accept the limitations you'd placed on my potential. The clock struck 8, its chime echoing through rooms that had been designed for laughter but filled only with the sound of my voice talking to people who weren't there and never would be. Why wasn't I ever enough? I asked the empty air, my reflection multiplied in wine glasses that would never touch lips, in silverware that would never serve the purpose I'd imagined when I'd arranged it with such care. I have a beautiful home now. I have stability. I have everything you said I'd never achieve. I have proof that the daughter you dismissed as a dreamer was actually the only one in this family with enough courage to make dreams real. The roast was getting cold. The wine was past its peak. The candles were burning down toward the point where wax would start dripping onto my grandmother's tablecloth. But for the first time in my adult life, sitting alone at a table set for 12 in a house I'd earned through sacrifice they'd never understood, I realized something that felt both devastating and liberating. Their absence wasn't a reflection of my worth. It was a revelation of theirs. The daughter who'd spent 10 years proving she belonged at their table had just discovered she'd been setting places for people who didn't deserve seats at hers. The question was what I'd do with that revelation now that I could no longer pretend it wasn't true. The empty chairs held more honesty than their presence ever had. And maybe, just maybe, that honesty was exactly what I needed to finally stop begging for love from people who'd never learned how to give it. At 9:15, I finally accepted what my heart had known since 7:30. they weren't coming. Not fashionably late, not stuck in traffic, not dealing with some family emergency that would eventually be explained with profuse apologies and promises to make it up to me. They simply weren't coming because my milestone wasn't worth rearranging their Saturday night plans. The sound of scraping food into the trash was brutal. Chicken bones clattered against the garbage can like insults, each piece of untouched roast a testament to effort that would never be appreciated. The lasagna I'd layered with the precision of someone building a cathedral went into containers that would fill my freezer for months, meals for one that had been prepared for 12. The wine I'd spent a week's grocery budget on got corked and stored in the refrigerator next to leftover asparagus that had been roasted to perfection for people who would never taste it. The chocolate cake, my grandmother's recipe that had taken 3 attempts to get right, sat under its glass dome like a monument to naive hope. Each scrape of the plate felt like erasing evidence of the evening I'd imagined. The evening where my mother would have complimented my cooking, where my father would have toured every room asking about square footage and property values, where Marcus would have grudgingly admitted that maybe his little sister had figured something out after all. I saved the dishes for last, not because they were difficult to clean, but because washing them felt like admitting defeat. Each wine glass I rinsed was a conversation that would never happen. Each dinner plate I scrubbed was a laugh that would never fill my dining room. Each piece of silverware was a memory that existed only in my imagination. When the kitchen was finally clean, when every surface gleamed with the kind of perfection that comes from having nothing else to do with your hands or your heartbreak, I walked out onto my front porch and sat on steps I'd swept that morning in preparation for footsteps that would never cross my threshold. The streetlights flickered with the inconsistency of everything else in my life that I couldn't control. Cars passed occasionally, their headlights sweeping across my driveway in patterns that briefly made me think someone was finally arriving, only to disappear around the corner toward houses where they actually belonged. I pulled my knees to my chest, the navy dress bunching around me like expensive armor that had proven useless against the only battle that mattered. The October air was crisp enough to justify the shivers that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the realization that was settling into my bones like winter preparing for a long stay. In that silence, surrounded by the suburban sounds of other people's Saturday nights, televisions through open windows, dogs barking in backyards, the distant hum of dinner parties I hadn't been invited to, it hit me with the force of truth that can no longer be avoided. Family doesn't always show up, even when you give them everything. The thought was so simple, so obvious, that I almost laughed at how long it had taken me to accept it. I'd spent 10 years building my worthiness, constructing achievements that would finally make me visible to people who had apparently decided long ago that I wasn't worth seeing. My hands traced the outline of empty picture frames I'd hung in the hallway, frames that were supposed to hold photos from tonight, images of my family gathered around my table, raising glasses to toast the daughter who'd finally made something of herself. Instead, they held nothing but the space where memories should have been, reminders of a story I'd written in my head that no one else had agreed to participate in. Their absence was louder than any words they could have spoken, more definitive than any criticism they'd ever delivered, more honest than any explanation they might have offered if I'd been brave enough to call and ask why. The house behind me echoed with a kind of grief I hadn't expected, the grief of being invisible to the people whose visibility I'd craved most. The grief of realizing that love isn't always reciprocal, that effort isn't always appreciated, that sometimes the people you'd do anything for wouldn't do the smallest thing for you. I'd grieved the loss of dreams before, the death of relationships, the failure of plans, the disappointment of hopes that hadn't materialized, but this was different. This was grieving the loss of a family that had never really existed except in my imagination, people I'd loved who had never learned to love me back with the same intensity. But as I sat on my porch steps, listening to the sounds of other people's lives continuing around me, while mine felt suspended between what I'd hoped for and what I'd received, something began to shift in the silence. The house wasn't empty, it was full. Full of me, my labor, my love, my 10 years of sacrifice that had created something beautiful regardless of who did or didn't come to witness it. Full of my story, which had never actually required other people's approval to be valid or valuable or worth telling. The walls I'd painted carried my fingerprints. The floors I'd chosen reflected my taste. The furniture I'd arranged created spaces that welcomed the woman I'd become, not the woman my family had expected me to remain. For the first time in my adult life, I was sitting in a space that belonged entirely to me, surrounded by proof of what I could accomplish when I stopped waiting for permission and started building the life I actually wanted, instead of the life that would make other people proud. The porch light illuminated my small section of Maple Street with warm yellow light that made everything look softer, more forgiving, more hopeful than it had appeared under the harsh fluorescence of my childhood kitchen, where I'd first learned that love could be conditional and approval could be earned through achievement. My house stood behind me like a fortress I'd built from dreams and determination, a place where I could finally stop performing worthiness for people who would never value the performance or the performer. A place where I could begin the process of learning to show up for myself with the same dedication I'd spent decades showing up for people who had never bothered to return the favor. The empty picture frames could be filled with different images. The dining room table could host different people. The kitchen could prepare meals for friends who understood that invitation to someone's home was a gift worth accepting, not an obligation to be ignored. I stood up from the porch steps, brushing off the navy dress my mother had once said was too expensive for someone in my position. Tonight, it felt exactly right for someone in my actual position. A homeowner, a woman who'd achieved what she'd set out to achieve, a person who no longer needed other people's presence to validate her own worth. The house was full of everything that mattered. The only thing it had been empty of was people who had never deserved to fill it anyway. I stood in my bathroom mirror at midnight. Mascara streaked down my cheeks like war paint from a battle I'd finally stopped fighting. The navy dress hung limp from my shoulders, expensive fabric that had failed to armor me against the truth I'd been avoiding for 36 years. But looking at my reflection, really looking, not just glancing while rushing to meet someone else's expectations, I saw something I'd never noticed before: strength. Not the kind that comes from other people's approval, but the kind that builds itself from within, when approval becomes irrelevant. "You waited 10 years to open these doors," I whispered to the woman in the mirror, my voice hoarse from crying but steady with something new. "You don't need them to bless what you built. This home is yours, and that is enough." The words felt foreign on my tongue, like speaking a language I'd never been taught but somehow understood. For the first time in my adult life, I was talking to myself with the same kindness I'd spent decades offering to people who had never returned the favor. Sunday morning arrived with sunlight that streamed through kitchen windows I'd chosen, across countertops I'd saved for, into a space that belonged entirely to me. I set a single plate on the dining table I'd refinished with my own hands, white ceramic against dark wood, simple and perfect. Eggs over easy, the way I liked them but never ordered when eating with family because someone always had an opinion about runny yolks. Wheat toast, not white, because I could choose carbohydrates that aligned with my preferences instead of the family standard. Coffee steaming in a mug I'd bought because it made me smile, not because it matched some inherited dinnerware set. For the first time in my life, the chair across from me didn't feel empty. It felt optional. The table that had been designed for 12 now served one with the same dignity and purpose. The candles I'd lit for absent family members could illuminate my own meals, my own thoughts, my own quiet conversations with the woman who'd had the courage to build something beautiful even when no one else believed she could. I picked up my phone and scrolled to the family group chat that had been silent for months, a digital space where my achievements were ignored and my struggles were dismissed with advice I'd never asked for. Without hesitation, I deleted myself from conversations that had never included me anyway. Then I dialed a number I should have called years ago. "Sarah? It's Aurora. I know it's been too long, but I was wondering if you'd like to come over for dinner. I finally bought that house I was always talking about, and I'd love to share it with someone who actually believed I could do it." The laughter that filled my house 3 days later wasn't the laughter I'd imagined during those 10 years of sacrifice. It was better. Sarah brought wine and stories about her art studio. Her girlfriend Maya arrived with homemade bread and compliments about my paint choices. My neighbor Janet, whom I'd met while planting flowers, came with curiosity about the woman who'd moved in next door and transformed the neglected colonial into something that glowed with care. Plates clinked against each other with the sound of genuine connection. Music swelled from speakers that had been installed for a different audience but worked perfectly for the right one. Wine glasses raised in toasts that celebrated achievements everyone at the table actually wanted to acknowledge. The dining table I'd refinished with such hope now shined under candlelight that illuminated conversations about dreams, struggles, successes, and failures, real conversations between people who had chosen each other rather than been assigned to each other by genetics and family obligation. This was what I'd been trying to create all along, I realized. Not a stage for performing worthiness to people who would never applaud, but a space where authentic connection could happen between people who understood that love is something you do, not something you inherit. The empty picture frames in my hallway began filling with new images. Sarah and Maya laughing over dessert, Janet teaching me about the neighborhood. Friends from work who had always invited me to their gatherings but who I'd never thought to invite to mine because I'd been saving my hospitality for people who didn't value it. Each photograph captured moments that existed because I'd stopped waiting for permission to create the life I actually wanted instead of the life that would make other people proud. The camera angles were imperfect, the lighting was amateur, but every image told the story of a woman who had learned to show up for herself and discovered that other people would show up too. Once she stopped begging for attention and started offering genuine friendship. They didn't come, I said to myself one evening while washing dishes that had been used by people who'd actually wanted to be at my table. And maybe they never will. The words carried none of the devastation they would have held a week ago. They were simply facts, like the color of my walls or the number of bedrooms in my house, information that described reality without requiring my emotional investment in changing it. But love is not measured in empty chairs, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. It's measured in the voices that actually echo through your walls, in the laughter that fills your spaces, in the people who choose to show up because they want to be there, not because they're obligated by blood or guilt or social expectations. I dried the last wine glass and placed it in the cabinet next to dishes that would be used again by people who appreciated the effort that went into preparing meals worth sharing. The kitchen gleamed with the satisfaction of work that had been valued, hospitality that had been received, effort that had been matched by gratitude. And I am no longer waiting, I whispered to the house that had become everything I'd hoped it would be, just not in the way I'd originally imagined. That night, I closed my front door and leaned against it, feeling the weight of wood that separated my space from a world that had taught me to measure my worth by other people's willingness to acknowledge it. The smile that crossed my face came from somewhere deeper than happiness. It came from the profound relief of finally understanding that I was enough, exactly as I was, with or without an audience. The camera in my mind panned across my dining room one last time, taking in the table set for one but ready for whoever might join me. Candlelight flickered over surfaces that reflected contentment instead of longing, possibility instead of disappointment. Not 12 empty chairs anymore. Just one woman, complete in her own space, surrounded by everything she'd built with her own hands and heart. One plate, one cup, one person who had learned that home isn't about who shows up to your housewarming party. Home is about who you become when you finally stop waiting for other people to tell you that you belong in the life you've created for yourself. If Aurora's story reminded you that you don't need other people's approval to validate your achievements, hit that like button and let me know in the comments which moment in her journey resonated most with you. Subscribe and turn on notifications because next week we're diving into another story about turning family rejection into personal empowerment. We're exploring the woman whose wedding was boycotted by her entire family and how she built a life so fulfilling they eventually begged for invitations back in. Share this video with someone who's been undervalued by their own family. Drop a comment telling me about a time you celebrated your achievements with people who truly mattered, or when you realized that love isn't about obligation, it's about choice. Your story might inspire our next video. Remember, they can dismiss your dreams, skip your celebrations, ignore your achievements, but they can't diminish what you've built through your own dedication and sacrifice. Sometimes the most powerful validation comes from learning you don't need validation at all. The most beautiful homes aren't filled with the people you're related to. They're filled with the people who choose to show up. Until next time, keep building the life that makes you proud. Not because others will applaud, but because you deserve to live surrounded by beauty, comfort, and people who genuinely celebrate your success.